hello, I'm Johnny's balloon. Just, you know, I'm all deflated, things like that. Oh no, I'm going. Okay, so here I am.
Great. Well, we're happy to have you with us, and maybe I'll just go ahead and jump right into it. Why is storytelling and spoken text so critical to your work?
Since in the last maybe 10, 12 years, I I started writing poetry and started using narrative as a support system for my more compositional work. And it became clear to me that the stories, or in any case, a use of text, is another way to have people enter into a different creative space, the listener and the speaker. And I just became fascinated with that. And then more and more, I started to really like what stories do for people, what that gives them, and also where that takes them outside of predictable space, sonic space.
Do,
And you know, because I read through some of these questions, one of the things I thought of was when I was in ninth grade, I think it was ninth grade, I had a speech class with Mrs. Nelson, and she had us do something called a personification speech. And I did this speech where I was a balloon. So I, you know, activated balloonness and told a story about being a balloon. And it was so, it rang so true to how I interact with an audience that I would just do it for people. Like when people were sitting around, they had nothing to do, I'd do my balloon story. And I feel like that carried through. Even when I'm improvising, I hear people in their sonic storyness as being them. And I find, well, maybe they need a maybe they need their ass kicked, or maybe they need support for a way to move through time. So that I think the verbal storytelling and the sonic storytelling have a lot to do with each other. I mean, it allows one to get out of the pitch world and into the noise or the extended, as an instrumentalist, the extended technique world, because you're expressing something that doesn't have grammar, but you can still build a grammar into it.
do you always write the do you always write the narrative ahead of time, or do you ever improvise the text?
Yeah, that was that caught me, gave me some thought, and I do improvise text. It's usually abstract,
Mhm.
you know, numbers and words and ways to actually for the text to be sound art. Every once in a while, I'll tell a story like thing if it occurs to me, like how once I was improvising in Duluth with members of Low, and we got to this place, and I thought, oh, now I should tell a Minnesota story. So I told about that my parents used to tell us if we got too close to the swamp, we would die. Because that's a Low kind of, the band Low? That's kind of their text is life and death and things like that. So every once in a while, I'll find that. And, when you mentioned it in your questions, I thought, whoa, I should do that more.
I'm just wondering, do you still know some of your balloon story?
Yeah.
Can you do some of it for
Some of
us?
the balloon story, is this being recorded visually also?
Yeah.
So it's an interview with that's the complete. Are you guys on it or is it just me?
All of us.
Yeah, because sometimes I mean recording in Zoom has different features. I think
It may go back and forth in the final product.
yeah, I think it was Johnny's balloon. So it was hello, I'm Johnny's balloon because I'm all deflated. And then I'm not quite sure what I go into. Maybe, what color I am and things like that. And then someone comes and goes, oh no, I'm going to just. And so that was sort of how, I suppose as a flute player, it made a lot of sense to be able.
So ninth grade, and you felt comfortable performing that, and did you have to perform it for your class? I guess it was a
At my
speech, right?
class. And then I decided I would do it for the assembly because everyone was sitting there waiting for nothing to happen. And I think it was that the ability or the desire to take myself out of a conventional space and time. Yeah, in ninth grade, yeah, it showed how socially maladjusted I was.
Or how socially adjusted you were and how others were not. So how was it received?
Everyone loved it. I mean, it was like, whoa, okay. Then the teacher was, I got an A.
So did that open you up to being able to like feel more free to do this sort of thing? Like was that a moment where like
I,
it sort of opened you up to new things or?
I think so. I think that it gave me an idea of public and private because I was a classically trained flutist, so there was no chance to do that at 14. And and I didn't want to be an actor or actress because that, when in younger years being an actor or actress, that kind of improvisation is also not promoted. I lived in the country for a part of my childhood, and there was a lot of interacting with the nature, conversing and doing, and so I had time and space to have that kind of interaction with myself and my environment. So people didn't seem that different than frogs or snakes or dogs.
What was the catalyst? You said about 10, 12 years ago you started incorporating storytelling into your work. What was the catalyst for you to bring that element into it?
I
In your
don't
improvisation?
I don't know. It could have been menopause. I just don't know because I was a terrible writer. I couldn't write. And then all of a sudden these texts would come, stories would come, and I'd put them down and use them. Um, I think it may have been just a part of my life that where I didn't need to be profound, I could be poetic, and I didn't feel the pressure of any professional or academic world. But it's still a mystery to me. You'll have to ask someone else. They might know.
So what are some of the recent stories that you've used in your work? What's the content or the inspiration for those?
The stories, it's so interesting that we've gotten into that. I'm I'm working very hard right now on how to on a bird. I have a This is your last question, but we can always jump to this question now. I have a commission to make a piece for a six member ensemble with a Baroque organ that can be steered via computer, OSC. My idea is that I will play the flute inside that organ because in pipe organs, there's space. And the story is about the swift, this bird, which is an amazing bird. They can stay in flight for like months, and they do everything up there: eat, procreate, and then eventually they come down and lay their eggs, and then they go up again. And so I'm studying the behavior of the swift and thinking of being inside this organ as a sort of nest thing or a birdhouse thing. And that'll be complex to find a way to deal with that.
Isn't there a book called The Swift? A novel?
by like
Uh,
um you mean like Wordsworth or something?
Something like this. It's when you said that jogged that for me. Like I feel like I remember seeing that's
Or a big long poem. Yeah.
something like this. That's amazing. I love that idea of being inside the organ. I don't know anything else really like that.
It's I get inside of it on Saturday because the place has been closed down for 6 months, and the premiere's been shifted. So I'll go in and start to try and get all the technology to work.
That's awesome. That's really exciting. Have you you've not done this kind of work before, right? With organ. Have you done much with organ at all?
No, I haven't done much with organ. Uh, I've done a little bit with organ because we have this incredible resource in town called the Organ Park that has 7 or 8 organs, and it's a church. It's not an old church, but it was a functioning as a religious church, and then some very rich people went in and sponsored an organ park. And so I've performed in there quite a bit, but I've never specifically written a piece for the big one of the big organs. This is a new organ, but I was part of the think tank, and so on what you would do electronically with it. Duh. So I wrote this article about how you should be able to place speakers inside of it, microphones inside of it. So they built this enormous patch bay, and they said to me, "Okay, now make a piece." And I thought, oh, that I had come up with some kind of poetic reason why something would happen inside the organ. And I thought, well, one of the big reasons would be I could go inside the organ. So my proposition is to put little speakers inside the organ, that are about this big. They use in cars for subwoofers, these monocore, to put like 6, I said 10, but to afford the technology to put 10 speakers in the organ, but at least 6 in the organ. And then they have contact mics and some more like lapel mics hanging around in the organ so I could record it, process it, play things back inside the organ, and then play. And the rest of the ensemble are guys, so they just stand outside and do other things, improvise with me.
So are there parts? So they're going to be improvising, or is any of that composed in any way?
No,
Structured?
the score I think will be a map of Europe and Africa, and it'll be like a Pauline Oliveira's Anea Lockwood score, a map that might move, have things, tracks, and that they'll choose a path, and we will then be migrating birds.
So this is the pathway that the swift would migrate.
That's back and forth.
Well, maybe this is a good segue to talk about your relationship with electronics then. About this, I'm very curious to know how you got into using electronics, and if in this piece and in most of your pieces, are you using Max MSP in that situation, and how did you get into using that software?
When you look at my website, because my improvisation environments are built in Max, then it seems as though that's my primary electronic door to electronics. It's my way of being able to hand off my work so that it's not only performable by me, and it's also performable by groups, also even without me. I have from the beginning for my relationship also improvising with electronics, I've used hardware, microphone being the first door, even with the flute, even the microphone being here and me using it as a receptacle of some kind of EQ filtering that you get through the tube. And then when I first started using any kind of hardware, it was the Nord micro modular, which isn't made anymore. It was like about this big. And then I graduated to the Nord modular G2, which was a rack mount. And the software interface to that looked like a analog synth, and it functioned as a virtual analog synth. So you would take cables and do this. Different than Macs because you didn't use objects. You well, similar to Macs, but it there was no way to have things function in over control things over time, for instance, the way software can, because this was just hardware. So it functioned pretty much like an analog synth. And I used that as a processor. And I had I had all this moral compass going on that I would never use delay, never use reverb, only have the sound follow my amplitude, not even do pitch shifting. Because pitch shifting always, I mean, this machine was pretty punchy, but even pitch shifting can have latency issues. One reason why I never used Macs for sound processing because of the latency, and also because I'm an intermediate programmer. And so I just couldn't get to that place where I could, in a really confident way, program processing in Macs, where it would be improvisational. Other people could do that for me, but so I had this G2, and it was great. I think we traveled around the world with it, and I was in different groups using it. Very transportable, but they discontinued it, which meant I didn't have an instrument. I didn't have a backup. And the story I tell was that I got so desperate to have a backup that I was scammed on like eBay. I paid money that for a non-existent G2. And then I thought, okay, got to get rid of this thing because I'm like out of it. And I'd been looking at for a couple of years the Kingma system, which was a financial leap. In fact, even now when I show up, I show up like in a club gig and there's my Kingma system, which I've been using ever since for about 9 years. People look and go, oh, that is so expensive. And I want to say, the head joint on my flute costs more than this. So, and they don't even care about my flute. Yeah. So then I invested in the Kingma system, which is also a software controlled hardware, but it's very powerful and has a lot more features that are desirable for what I do. And it's built and designed. It's designed by a woman who I was an undergraduate with, Carla Scaletti, at the University of New Mexico. And then she moved to Illinois and went on with her partner to design and build it. So it's my partner now, my part of my integrated instrument.
That's nice. We just had Carla at Virginia Tech maybe 2 years ago. Yeah, she was really nice. Are you familiar with our space here at Virginia Tech called the Cube?
It's that's you also have Eric Lyon with you.
That's right. He's a good friend of mine and my colleague.
Yeah, we were in UCSD together.
Oh, nice.
So I'm familiar. Yeah, I'm also familiar with Sark when he left Sark with another musical partner who also is there with you, who I don't know personally. But you,
at Virginia Tech?
yeah, like another friendly nerd.
Yeah, that would be probably Ben. He's actually the director of the Institute for Creativity, Arts, and Technology here, which the Cube is part of that. So maybe sometime you can come here and play in that room. It's a really fantastic room.
Yeah, I would so love to.
So, Anne, I'm wondering, as you've moved through all these different modes of electronics, how the different technology, hardware and software affected your artistic output, particularly improvisation? Like, how did that open you up or lead you in a new direction each time? Because obviously that affects your instrument, and your instrument is going to affect what you do. So I'm just wondering how that evolved.
Yeah, in terms of improvisation, technology can extend my instrument in ways where just a microphone can't. One artistic milieu involvement that made possible is even when I was using, for instance, in this series I ran, the Kratgeluiden, even when I was using just a microphone, like a really good microphone, the guitars and the drums and the saxophones and the synths, they could be louder than me. But with electronics, I could construct a sound that was me and bigger than me, not necessarily louder, but had a information sonic context that could be heard or could be louder even, so that I knew when I needed to, I could be present. And so it gave me a comfort zone of being present without always having to get the piccolo out and play the highest note in the piccolo. It also gave me the chance to play more roles. Flutists are, like violinists, were raised in the classical domain not to be the driving force, harmonic or rhythmic force in an improvisation or in a musical piece. But I had then with the electronics the opportunity to give myself place myself in the orchestration and give myself a musical role in so many more, such a big range. It also it gave me the chance to be a guy, because and to really understand guyness without having to be a guy.
Because primarily you were playing with men, right?
Way primarily. Because improvisation in general, that scene, the free improv scene in Europe in any case, is still gender gender balanced or gender out of balanced. And then my instrument is not a free improv instrument in usually. And then in the electronics, that's even one step further, where there are fewer women, unless they're like probably with Elizabeth, unless they're also using film and other media, and but just playing, you get on stage with your electronics. That's been an evolving field, and I was really excited to be part of that.
So why do you think there, I mean, this is getting maybe in another direction, but the gender imbalance, has that changed at all? Has it improved in Europe, I guess, specifically since that's where you are?
Mm, I think it's been discussed much more, and I think there are more DJs, and there are more women who come out with stuff. I think in the acoustic with electronics, that's still a question: who is even going to be an improviser with electronics? Because of the specialization that we all fall into. People want time to practice and hang out and play their acoustic improv, or they want to take all this time and they stop practicing their instrument because they're so involved in the button twiddle nerdy part. And the meeting is, I find that still an evolving part of our practice.
So how did you balance the two as you were learning to use technology, but also still maintained a really high level of flute playing? How did you balance the two along the way?
Practiced a lot, and I gave myself the space, and this is where I was learning to be a guy, that I could be less than the best programmer, that I would use, for instance, using hardware meant I didn't have to figure out latency because the hardware had that. And using the instruments in my setup, where I could be an intermediate programmer and still get results, and then uh, not beat myself up too much for not being the most brilliant electronics programmer. And then with flute, yeah, to take it on an exciting path and not necessarily keep up my I don't play Bach in public, for instance, because there are plenty of people who would love to do that, and to understand what the balance there is.
What was your, or how did you feel that your reception was in the scene in the early years, as maybe being one of the only women doing that in Amsterdam or Europe or something like this?
Yeah.
Did you feel welcomed into that community?
Well, you know what? I was going to tell you, because when you asked when you sent one of the questions about the trajectory, I went back because and I'll get to that, but I wanted to go through the significant moments um, that you said, going back to, where was it? The significant moments in my uh, improvisation. Oh, where did I put that up? Just a moment. Oh yeah, it was down here further. Yeah, I'll go through just a little bit of a timeline, because we still have time.
Oh yeah.
That I When I was in graduate school. No, when I was in graduate school, I was in an improv group, and this was 1979. So it was sort of in the cagey and still uh, experimental tradition, University of Illinois, which was one of the last vestiges of experimentalism in that wave. And we made an improv group, and we played the Stockhausen aus den Sieben Tagen, and really, felt like we were like brilliant masters of this kind of new stuff. And then we had an improv group, and that was significant for me to know that could be, that was a legitimate way to be a musician, and it attached me to the New York scene, and so I started to understand that is music making, especially there. And then I moved to Los Angeles, and had a day job and taught music, taught lessons, and did office work. And I had a group with a guy named Ron George and a woman named Susan Rawcliffe, and she made clay flutes, just ocarinas and all this stuff. And he was a drummer, but not a drummer. He just kind of built a lot of percussion things. And we would improvise. And we built a practice where we would improvise, record it, listen, record it, improvise, listen, and played concerts in the early 80s. And so Los Angeles welcomed that. I also had another group with Vinny Golia. Do you know this name? He's a multi-reed player who lives in LA. You might look him up because he was really part of the driving LA improvising big band. Dresser played in his big band. A lot of the guests were, LA improvisers in the 80s. And so I played with him, and I played with a guy named David Acker, who was quit playing clarinets, but was Zappa's copyist at that time. So that was kind of cool. He's now John Adams' copyist. But we had this wind trio, and that was also, we just played concerts in calls and radio shops. We even played on the Monday evening concerts as a way to say, look, this is a form of music making. And then I went to the University of UCSD in San Diego, and John Fonville was there. Do you know who he is? He's just retired a year and a half ago, I think. He's a flute player. He was like super avant-garde flute player. And we formed a microtonal flute duo and improvised and played concerts, like in American New Music I don't know if it still exists, like New Music America. Does that exist anymore? Probably not. That was like that was the 80s. And so I was always part of an improvising ensemble, finding, because when you were talking about also practicing improvisation, one of the ways to practice improvisation is with other people, because that will take you to places that your fantasy in combination with someone else's fantasy, or even in combination with people who have no fantasy, that will give you new places to go, new strategies. And then I moved to Holland, which was a bastion. Like improv here was a career, which was unbelievable because that was money was flowing in the early 90s. And I was part of a group called no, I was part of a few groups that the core members were all of these people playing in all these improv ensembles. The driving most core was I wasn't in it, but it was the Instant Composers Orchestra, ICP, with Misha Mengelberg as the composer, but it was also very much an improvising ensemble. And the significant moment, because this goes into some very significant moments, because I had significant moments with all these other groups, those magical moments on stage where you'd go, oh, I never thought of that. Oh, I never did that. Oh, this is such a fantastic sound or feeling with these people that I'm with. Or is that me playing? Oh, no, that's me in combination. So you can't, I feel like you can't really do that without someone else, or without your electronics, who is the other, now the someone else, because I get tired of people. So in 1991, George Lewis was at a improv festival, which was, I think, called the October meeting in those days. And I was with a group with him, and we went to Delft, a place, and there was a group playing, but my daughter was, I think, 3 months old, something like that. And the dressing room was about this big. So my husband was in the dressing room and we were playing in various combinations. And I could hear this baby in the back. So I went back and stuck her on my breast, quieted her down, gave her back to my husband, and came out and played like this whopping solo that turned into a piece of mine that has just, has worked. But I found that sort of moment of between the person and the stage person, and George, he was sitting there filming my feet and saying, my dad really loved that performance of yours because of your feet. And this whole combination of unexpected heightened moments bring improvisation into a place where it's a life experience. And you get those on stage. I'm going through time, the orchestra, this guy, Cor Fuller, who's deceased now, he put together a group, and we were a real hodgepodge. And I had to play solos with 2 sax players. There were 2 drummers, sometimes 3 drummers. And, and then they point, say, okay, and play a solo. And I think, what kind of solo am I going to play here? But it pushed me into also taking my ground when we talk about women, taking my ground and playing the solo I needed to play, and not think, oh no, what key are we in? And are we going to play over changes or not? But just to get it done and to know I could steer, as I was saying, I wasn't playing with electronics at that time, but I could steer this group from behind by not being a flute player, by being the other me. Those are significant moments for me. And the last one was building this, well, not the very last one, but in this whole big trajectory, was building this series called the Krak Geluiden, which means squat sounds, because it was in a squat. And again, the effort we had to make, I don't know if you read any of the articles, but I went into a regular improv series that I played on regularly, and I said, I'd like to start using some electronics. Could I curate a little bit of electronics? And they said, oh, no, no, we don't like electronics. So then I thought, well, okay, how am I going to get this done? And I went to an older, a senior person who had established a hall that had originally been a squat. And I said, you know, I could, his name is Jan Wolf. He's also deceased now, but he started the Icebreaker, which was where a lot of new music in the 80s, 70s and 80s happened. And I said, well, so Jan, how am I going to do this? I probably you're not going to give me a night a month, are you? And he goes, no. And I said, well, so I have to squat, don't I? And he goes, that sounds really good. And there were squats at that time. So I went to a squat and started this series. That was fine. The only thing was is that even to keep it warm, we had to cut wood and throw it on a fire. And everyone had to bring their own amplifiers. They had to carry them up these like 2 flights of metal stairs on the outside. So just this whole frontier behavior and desire gave us, and we were going to do it with our electronics because that was my rule anyway. It gave us such a, it's like the Enterprise going into space that we eventually we were kicked out of the squat, and squats were forbidden in Amsterdam after we demonstrated and everything. And we found a hall, and I got money, and the country, it became a buzz because everyone wanted a series like that. Even nobody who ever came to a concert thought they knew everything about us, because we became an international landing spot for this instruments with electronics. So in that, I got to play with all kinds of people, and we all learned which cables we would usually forget because there were no cables there. We learned who we wanted, you know, what kind of settings worked, didn't work. And it was, 7 years, once a week of building a scene that it was fantastic.
So in terms of improvising, particularly with others or even with your electronics, since you regard that as like another person, like what makes a moment special in terms of, you know, when things are really clicking? Like how would you describe that kind of moment?
I see it now as a stretch of time where I feel that through that stretch of time, something has built or unbuilt or moved into a situation, a sonic situation that it is touching. And it's not necessarily heartrending. It could be exciting in a way because of silence, but it's found its relationship, and through testing and change to a situation that can be recognized as art. Now, get some professor or some graduate student to tell you what art is. I'm not going to do that. But it has an aesthetic quality that is moving. And people talk about flow and people talk about creativity, but it's a place where you're cognitive. You're still, I feel still that I'm cognitively on a buzz, that I can think, but not I can think, but everything else going on, I can feel with my body, I can hear, I can see, I can make time stretch, I can make time collapse, I can even be angry because my involvement is full. And it's not just a moment, it can go on and on. You don't know.
So it's kind of like a state of being in a way, like a.
I would give it that it's it, what is that word when you float? Suspension. It's a suspension in a world that has multiple dynamics that are feeding me and hopefully whoever else is involved.
Can you talk a little bit about the development of your Kingma quartertone flute and how you got involved in that instrument, and have you worked on developing any other instruments similarly?
And number one, it's a great improvising tool because it can do stuff that the conventional flute can't, which then playing with certain people, I can bring things into a surprise area where they'll think, whoa, how unflute is that? This one aspect of it that has come out in other interviews is that I am willing, very willing to do things I can't do because I like that. That's a little bit the boy thing. Boys will climb a tree and not know how they're going to get down. Girls will sit with 10 girls at the bottom of the tree and discuss how they could maybe go up and down the tree. And the discussion will be fulfilling. The so being thrown into things I can't do, I was a graduate student at the University of Illinois, and I was the assistant to someone named Alex Murray, who had developed his own model of a flute. And Noah has seen this flute, and for people who play the flute, the Murray flute went back to the flute that was designed in 1850 when the keys came on the instrument. I won't go into all the details of everything in between. And what he had done is he had switched the rolls of our pinky back to the 1850 flute of this pinky. But then he thought, why not switch the roll of this pinky? And he had a flute designed and built and that had this system, which was more in tune than the flute in the 1970s, because of where he could have the holes placed or have holes taken away that were repeats because of the development of the flute due to the French and the American industrialization. Because when the Germans changed the flute, the French did not change because they had conservatoire. And then when the Americans started building flutes in the 1900s, then they took the French model. So Alex Murray was trying to return and develop. And I was his graduate student. So then I played on his flutes, which is a model nobody else plays on except some of his students. And then I had learned he had the history of flutes. So I learned to play on the historic instruments, including I had built one of these Murray systems. And then I had another flute once I got out of there. I had another flute built that was, for me, more reasonable, that didn't have so many repair issues as that flute. And so when I moved to Holland, I started building a relationship with Eva Kingma, who lives in Holland. I mean, this is one of the flukes of history. The people who designed the electronic instrument and the vintage instrument are both women. Who would have thought? So she had been working with a Dutch flute player, Jos Schwanenberg, who had requested an open hole alto flute. So she built the first open hole alto flute. Open hole being, people in this interview probably would know, you're all musicians, but that some of these holes are open. And then that became, from what I was thinking about, how did then she start wanting to build this quartertone? And I think what happened was some people in the flute world, probably Robert Dick, István Matus, who is Hungarian, came to her seeing that she was a flute builder who was experimental. And they started requesting, or I'm not sure about István, but I know Robert Dick started working with her on trying to build a flute that would play only, or it would play to his desires. And this flute had holes in places no one would want to go. It's my experience, having come from Alex Murray, Alex Murray was not only a flute teacher, he was an Alexander technique teacher. So he was working out the supreme balance, that the Murray system was even better balanced, so all this really how a flute player could play in the most efficient way. And Robert Dick was more how the flute player could get the most out of everything. And Ava asked a few of us, it's a very small group, to be consultants on the Kingma flute. And so I helped her launch the flute, like at the French convention and the American convention and the German convention, and wrote the articles in the flute journals with consulting where historically they've put a hole, but that was hard to balance, and how to get it to be a conventional flute with only 6 extra keys. But I played such weird music, and I was such a renegade in my own way. I didn't stay as the person who brought her flute to the conventional flute world, because that just wasn't my role. So I took it and I used it as like I said, for improvisation. I wouldn't know what to do without it now. It's been in the shop for 2 weeks because I took it in, and my repair person, who's the only person who could repair it, said, no, this has got to stay. This is going to cost you a lot of money. So I just picked it up today. And I've only been playing my quartertone alto flute for 2 weeks. But let me tell you, I've gotten really strong.
I think probably Noah and I are ready for a quartertone saxophone.
Yes.
That would be fantastic. People have looked into it, but for sure she would be, to look at her designs on her alto and bass flutes. Have you looked
Not
at
in
her
detail at those lower instruments.
Yeah, and she would be very willing to have dialogue with you on because she's been through a lot in very, very many years. She would be someone who would have a dialogue about what works and what doesn't work.
But that's going to get expensive because I want a soprano, an alto, a tenor. Like, I'd want all of them in quartertones.
Yeah, so get a really fancy job and have them buy them for you.
I'll get right on that, Anne.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how that instrument has gone on to shape your musical language, and how it has affected the way that you would choose to improvise in a setting based on what you have available to you now through that instrument?
Yeah, the most obvious to me is the multiphonics, because of the logic of being able to open and close half holes. That's why you as saxophone players would love to have it. Is I can play a systematic sets of multiphonics that, as an improviser, gives me the chance to be a harmonic player. And also with string players who are playing double stops, I can come in with that kind of sonority in a much more significant way. And the other thing is just the glissando possibilities, that, there goes the trombone player. They're going to do that thing. Well, I can too. And then I can come at it from this direction or this direction and circular breathe it. And so it gives me these connections that as a conventional flute player, you have to do a lot of fudging. further, also, yeah, being able to go out of pitch in pitch. So I have all kinds of trills and tremolos that are less, that can really make clusters with other people because of the space, the pitch spacing.
You mentioned glissando. Have you ever played the glissando head joint?
No, it's creepy,
Okay.
but I'm sure it's fantastic as a device for many people.
The interface is odd.
It works great for a lot of people. It doesn't, yeah, there's too many move. No, that moving part doesn't interest me. I feel like I would sacrifice. No, I would sacrifice the finesse of the specific embouchure detail that I love. But I promote, I stand behind it. Just not with my mouth.
So Anne, I'm wondering, you've played a lot with your husband and your daughter, and I'm wondering, like, broadly speaking, what's that like, and how did that come to be, and how has it changed over time? And I listened to some of the Modern Genetics album. I haven't gone through the whole thing, but it's like vastly different than the other stuff you've done, and I'm just wondering how that works.
The the two pieces from me, Muffled and Away, are those are pure improv, free improv to a max patch that generates sine tones and text randomly. And I play, at least on that album, but I've played Away with a lot of people, and this Muffled I've played with some people. But that's improvisation with my daughter, and I made that piece. She asked me to make it for her junior recital at New England Conservatory, which was, and I had controls set up with Touch OSC on our phones. So there was my daughter trying to get a degree in classical violin, and she said, Mom, but we got to do a piece together. So that's actually one very enriching thing, to bring in improvisation so early on in a personal way. With my husband, but otherwise with my daughter, we've played written music together, and we've been able to improvise in settings together. With my husband, David is a electric guitar player, singer-songwriter, gone orchestra composer who understands so many different kinds of music. In fact, as a PR, he just arranged the entire Sgt. Pepper's album for cello octet, which goes on this weekend in a festival, but it has to go on online. But he's managed to get a cello octet with bells on their ankles and kazoos and extended techniques to somehow not be boring without a vocalist for that entire album. So he has a lot of resources. And when we wanted to play together, that was late 80s, and we had to find a language for ourselves. And because I prefer to improvise, and I'm not that interested in counting measures. Like, after 12 measures, we change the chord, or after we do this 24 times, then that will be the next section. But guitar players, that's it, dun, 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 dun. Okay, here's the next one, dun, dun. So he developed that language for our duo, and his language with electric guitars, he strings it with other gauges, like even bass, really thick strings. So and he tunes mostly scordatura. So he needs like 2 or 3 guitars, or there's a lot of space between songs. And he plays with an ashtray sometimes, extended techniques. And so I will improvise within a set, an agreed language, and just know when he gets to a certain part, then I'll do a certain part. But the other thing is that quite a percentage of our songs are then he just plays his thing and I do something else. And that seems to work too. And once we have this story that we tell where we were playing with Malcolm Goldstein, who's a violinist from away another generation. And he came over and we were improvising. And Malcolm said, you know, I'm a little fearful of your marriage because you guys don't play like together. And we said, yeah, that's what we do. So he's left me enough space to basically improvise within a context. And there are times always where, like at the end, he does something 5 times and I get started a little late. So I play 1 note extra. And I still work really, really, really hard to try and end at the same time. And as far as the cover tunes go, they come from different bands. David and I were once in a band called the Flatland Kings, where we all created cover tunes of Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys numbers. And we were a band of improvisers and rock players. And we also had a band called Rebert, where we did covers of Burt Bacharach tunes. So some of that album comes out of that repertoire. And Diamanda, when she was 10, I think 11, we had her play in the Bim House with us, with this country western band. She was supposed to improvise Indian tunes or something.
And you talked about playing chord changes and so forth in your improvisation. I'm wondering if you have studied jazz improvisation at all in your development and if that has played an impact in your free improvisation at all.
I think it's common among classically trained treble instruments is that playing over chords is tricky because our deepest background is to play correctly what's in front of us, and the chords will take care of themselves. And we also function oftentimes as obligato instruments. I am personally able to play a drum function, and to play harmonic driving harmonic lines that I make up, but I'm not comfortable playing a solo and counting to 16 4 times or to 4 16 times. And my high school band director, who, I was like, the star flute player in the high school band. And he wanted me to learn to play jazz because he was a jazzer. And it just didn't speak to me. And I think some of it is our models don't sound that good. Eric Dolphy, yes. But who are the guys from back then? From like the 60s and 70s. Those flute players, they weren't interesting to me. So I didn't have a model that I felt compelled to sound like. And playing with jazzers now, I can go inside the language. I can function in the blues because the blues is pretty simple. But I can't be remarkable unless I start playing multiphonics and do other things. I find it interesting that it never spoke to me enough. Some of it I think is the instrument. And the other is it always gets into this kind of romping thing, which aesthetically I'm not a romping person. And I So it could be also even just the emotional territory of going that I just think, well, but we could just be playing Vivaldi if we just simplify these chords, and I would be fine.
I think probably in the 60s and 70s, most of the jazz flute players were saxophonists trying to hang at the flute.
Herbie Mann, wasn't he?
Sure, yeah, he was a great flute player.
Yeah, it was great, but it was like foo, 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 foo in sound.
Hmm.
And I couldn't find a way to make that meet as a young teenager. And then going further, I just became so much more interested in abstract conceptual improvisation because my colleagues were there doing it. And then with electronics, to relate to the sound world of electronics, to learn to sound like an electronic instrument, even without the electronics. That was, Varese handed us some great repertoire and Xenakis to be able to do that as instrumentalists. And then when it became able for me to play with electronics, I wasn't that interested in building sequences that I could play over. Although I'm developing a 12-tone minimal music patch. It's my next goal is to be able to where it shifts. It's still doing thirds, my sequencer. It's not really a sequencer, but at any rate, I'm trying to learn to shift to hear whatever tone it's shifting to as a tonic, and play a kind of extended minimal music because I've never done that. So I am now trying to get myself to hear chord changes, just abstract random ones.
So, Anne, what's your flute practice look like these days? Like, is your flute practice driven by the compositions you're writing or by like the groups you're playing with? I'm just wondering what you're working on these days and how practice is going.
What I do is I turn on either baseball or basketball because I subscribe to MLB. Well, my husband subscribes to MLB and I subscribe to NBA. And I turn on a basketball game because, that's a good time. It's not live because nothing here is live. So it's some basketball game. And it's great because then I have all these people I'm playing with. I turn the volume somewhat low and I play a whole scheme of harmonics so that I feel like wherever the instrument as noise wise can be tuned. And it also keeps me fit. And it's a fantastic environment to feel the instrument just filter. So I do a whole bunch of harmonics, and then it's probably well into the first quarter. And then I play some scales, the whole, all the keys. And then I play a whole multiphonics, not all the multiphonics, but on the quartertone flute, because I was saying there's a very logical sequence. So I go through a long sequence with the multiphonics, all the while feeling like I'm improvising with these men jumping around or catching balls or doing something athletic. And then I turn on a ground tone and I play either arpeggios or because I'm practicing being able to play minimal music, I play da 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 da. So I play basically a sort of Philip Glass through every key. And by then it's about an hour and a half. I've been doing that on the alto, which is a real muscle. My back is really tired after that. But what it's giving me is a sense of tuning. And what I love is all the resultant tones. So I'm working with myself as an ensemble and all the aspects of the flute that I love. And so that's how I'm staying in shape and being ready to improvise. And then I go play with my electronics, and there I'm just doing whatever to see what this sound needs to make interesting music. So that's where I take myself out of this very classical or modern music person.
When you sit down to compose music, do you mostly do it with the flute in your hand, trying some ideas and see what works, or are you writing ideas out, or?
I make a, a time structure and I envision what things need to happen or what I would like to happen, which is extremely traditional to have architecture, these spaces of time. And because I don't write score music most of the time, then I'm thinking, what would I improvise in this place? Or what would we all be improvising in these places to make music? And then I start to build the a lot of times an electronic component or like what you're saying, a flute, technical, sonic, emotional place that we all as instrumentalists, we have these, but thinking about what the piece would need in these places. And most of the time I have one or two things I'm not sure I'll be able to do because that'll give me the improvising leap to see if I could maybe do that, like this improvising minimal music. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do that. So I'm working on it. And sometimes I have text, like a story, but either the text comes along with it or, yeah, that's always a balance. There's never a predictable relationship of what gets done first or second or third in the process. And most of the time, I really don't know what it's going to be like until I craft it with my hands, with me doing it. Even if it means other people are going to be playing with me, I still have to know what it feels like. That's the composer performer versus the composer composer or the improviser improviser. But I leave space that if this goes somewhere else, that might be pretty interesting if it needs to. Where did I read? Oh, I was reading about chronoscopic time. Before they invented the clock, we had a different sense of time. We didn't even really have rhythm necessarily. Or what was rhythm before we don't know. And I've been looking into why do things have to follow things logically? Well, I don't know why. And starting to think about if because we build logic into the sun coming up, the plants grow, the sun goes down. But we haven't, and we're trying to build logic into COVID. Every day there's a new theory about the logic of the universe and COVID and things like that. And we're such smart human beings, and we're going to build some logic into that. But so much of our day, if we didn't put an architecture in our heads, is not necessarily moment to moment logical experiences. So I'm working with that now on what if you could build some of that into the piece or not. We don't know. I don't know. People are extremely moved when something happens that they didn't expect, because then they have to jump, then they have to give more of themselves to make space for that.
But that's just sort of how life goes, generally speaking. We tend to have plans and they don't ever go the way we plan. And so, but it surprises us every time.
Yeah,
Somehow.
surprises us every time.
Doesn't make any sense.
No, no, we're such archaic beings in that way. So that's the improvisation thing, is also to know that the surprise. I mean, the colleagues of mine who can surprise in an interesting way, where you're also somehow cognitively involved, like, oh wow, then that's what I really admire, and that's
So,
what feeds me too.
yeah. So, so what else are you working on? I know you mentioned a few projects. So you're doing the minimalist flute thing, you're doing the organ piece. Is there anything else up your sleeve at the moment?
The other thing that I just got back to town from yesterday is in the I'm making a collaborative piece with a visual artist, the same person who did the visuals for this piece Utter that you saw, and she's making a film. It's it's about data and landscape. And we found this place, well, she found it, where there's a data center, but there's all that other it's like an industrial park, but it borders on a haven, which is a port on a river that goes, because we're at the end of the Rhine and the Maas, so it comes through France and it goes through. So it's a port with all those containers, and then there's the industrial park, and then there's a path and some trees and green stuff, and then there's a river. And we had a drone that filmed a dancer doing mostly pedestrian things, but also in one place dancing, showing the industrial area and this border to nature. And so the piece is about the landscape and us in nature, but actually we are in that data center. I mean, if you think about it, all of you is in a data center, in a bunch of data centers. So this is confronting us with our concept of ourselves. That's the film. And yeah, I have to come up with some music for it. I think, once the film, and there'll be some text, and she wants the text to be a certain way, but I can't do text a certain way. So I'm going to have to let it turn over in my belly for a while before I can come up with it. But I've been setting different electroacoustic flute and electronics environments of about 3-4 minutes to build for the piece. That's where the minimal music comes in. And it's pretty exciting to have this 30-minute piece that I'm not quite sure yet how all of it's going to turn out. And this is the greatest thing, because we got a grant. I mean, we almost got enough, so I'm not quite sure how much is going to come out of my pocket. But because we can pay a drone filmer, we can pay a dancer, and we can pay for the work time. And I'm going to work with a film sound designer, so like a feature film sound designer, to help me with the sound design, which is different than like the people at Virginia Tech that do acousmatic intelligent sound. It's going to be a guy who knows how to just kind of get a room to feel like it's the same space as we feel like we're going to be drones. And it's the very first quad piece I've ever done. So it's incredibly exciting, because I don't know if you've played in a quad environment. See my new 2 little Genelecs behind me? Those were like a COVID purchase, because now I have quad in my little space here. But as an acoustic player, it's really hard to hear quad, because you hear yourself in space. And in a way, we are the most enriching, interesting uses of space, particularly, well, the flute even more than the sax, because sound comes out here and it comes out here. So the flute is not a tremendously directional instrument, except here it's quite directional, but it kind of fills. Whereas speakers need to be so tweaked to fill sound. And I'm very curious to be able to improvise with shifting sound coming out of speakers. Whereas if you're in a room with a band, those of us who are acoustic can walk around, go stand by the drummer, go stand by the viola player, and we can play with space and sound in a much more, actually a better way. All this, when you talk about microtonal, that's only for keyboard players because they can't play all these sliding pitches, any pitch. So then we talk about these microtones for them to be able to push a button and play them. When you talk about space, we play space all the time. It's just these speaker things that have to do with calculating space. So that is very interesting to me,
So
and also scary.
yeah. So is the dancer going to be is the part getting filmed before you write the music, or is the dancer going to be dancing to your music?
She's filmed. We just finished
Oh,
yesterday
so
with
that's interesting.
her. So I was just standing around, and it's supposed to be about data. And of course, I'm thinking, what could I do about data? Because I've experimented with using weather and my running data. I did that last year. That's on my website, this experiment. So my new thought is, because data for us is how do we get rid of data, not how do we add more data. And most of the time with electronic music, when you're mapping data, what's so exciting is that if it's pitch or timbre or harmonic spectrum or physical movement, then that adds data to trigger and make something happen. And I'm thinking more now, what we as people could really use is that every time I blow, data could go away. So by the end of the piece, maybe there'd just be a sine tone. But what I have some toys. I have this, which is, this is an anemometer, and it registers wind speed and humidity and temperature. So I thought of having that somehow influence the music. But this is really something. This, I had someone make a little box. This is an anemometer. There's a little bit about this on my website, but so that it comes out in knots, the speed of the air, into a max patch, so that I can, as a wind, something. So maybe I won't even play the flute in this piece. I'll just, every time I blow, there'll be less data. And then by the end, we'll just be so happy when all the data is gone. I don't know. So this is the way I work on pieces, is I have some hardware and some software and some ideas. And then in moments of pure confusion, some poetry may emerge, or sounds. But that is pretty cool, huh?
Yep.
I love your toys.
Well, thanks so much, Anne. I'm very satiated. I have a lot to think about. That was so inspiring. I love talking to you because you're always doing new things and challenging yourself, which I think is really incredible and very inspiring.
Yeah, thanks so much for chatting with us, Anne.
You're welcome. But I have to say, because I don't know you, Kyle, I can't say that. But Noah, I follow you. And it's so, maybe I told you that. For me, it's so fantastic to have younger, inspiring role models for me, because I don't have older ones. So there was one point in my life, I think it was when Dana Jessen and Katie Young, I had them come play in I worked out being able to play with them in Amsterdam, and I thought, right, these can be my inspiring role models, even if they're like years younger than me. So thank you, Noah.
Thanks. That's very flattering. I appreciate it, but so it works both ways. I mean, that's what having colleagues is all about. So
Yeah. Take care.
thanks a lot, Anne.
Thank you.